Our next speaker, Dr. Andrew Gardner. He's Senior Lecturer in Archaeology, the Archaeology, I should say, of the Roman Empire at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. His wide-ranging research interests cover Roman Britain, the history and theory of approaches to studying social change through archaeology. That's a bit of a mouthful. Among his many publications, he has edited a couple of volumes of Track, so helping on that. And I'd note amongst two recent things, he's published through the ICS here with Herring and Lomas, Creating Ethnicities and Identities in the Roman World. And I think the most recent monograph is an archaeology of identity, soldiers and society in late Roman Britain. So I think the message is fairly clear. Identity is an interest, and I hope that's what we'll be hearing about. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me here today. Can everyone hear me at the back? Okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, so as Tom just said, my interests sort of encompass a range of themes, and in fact I teach archaeological theory as well as Roman archaeology at the Institute. And I'm interested in the history of ideas as much as in how we use them. And so I'll say a few things at the beginning of my lecture, expanding a bit upon what we've just heard about this particular term, which we have as the title for today's sort of session with a question mark attached, Romanisation. And then as my title, a sort of Post-Romanisation Perspectives, I'll go through then some thoughts on moving beyond, or why we need to move beyond, talking about Romanisation in the Roman world, looking at just a couple of examples from military and rural archaeology in Britain. My remit actually was to talk about Britain and Gaul, but I couldn't possibly do that in half an hour. It's quite hard to even cover anything really to do with Britain in that period. So I'll stick to Britain. I will, however, stretch the boundaries of the Principate and start talking about the late Roman Empire a bit as well, because I think one of the key reasons we need to sort of unpick what we mean by the word Romanisation is the trajectory of the Roman Empire over the long term, and what we actually see developing in the late Roman world, and how that might be possible to conceive of if Romanisation were an effective model. Of course, I contend that it is not. And then I'll sort of finish up thinking again a bit more about the different ways of being Roman that don't fit comfortably within a single blanket term, and a few questions for the future. So, why has this one small, humble word become so sort of vexatious in Roman archaeology, particularly in Romano-British archaeology, I guess it has to be said, although certainly with a fair bit of debate in at least the Netherlands and in some extent North America amongst Roman scholars. After all, it is just a word. Well, the trouble with words is they shape our thinking, and that's really the crucial issue. So we have to be careful about them. And of course, with Romanisation, there is a specific history of the development of this concept and of this term. And I've said there that it's a seductive idea. I'd originally on this slide put the word troublesome, because it is troublesome, but it's also seductive, and that's why it was powerful for at least 100 years of Roman studies, and why we're still talking about it now, because the seduction of the word Romanisation is that it's simple. It appears to simplify what is, of course, a vast time and space entity, the Roman Empire, and a vast range of processes. That, of course, is the problem with it, but nonetheless, that simplicity is seductive. In terms of its history, of course, this is well known and very well established, and a lot of people have been working on the historiography of Romanisation for the last 20 years as a concept. And of course, its origins are in the sort of mid to late 19th century in the work of Mommsen, and then in application to Roman Britain in the work of Francis Haverfield at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, that context is no accident. in the sense that both in its German and British context of application, we're talking here about periods of sort of complex relationships, both in terms of internal dynamics within the British and certainly the German state in the late 19th century, and also then the dynamics of empire, both in the by then long established British Empire and the sort of nascent German Empire of the end of the 19th century. So that imperial context, but also crucially with a national dimension, and that's important to remember too, and the sort of the struggles of emerging nation states of the late 19th century reconciling their own ambitions with the fact that in the past they had been conquered by the Roman state. These are the key sort of factors influencing how Romanisation developed as a concept. And those parallels, of course, were sustained in academic work up until and indeed beyond the mid-20th century, certainly in Romano-British archaeology, well into really the late 20th century. The story in Germany is a little bit different. Romans went out of fashion somewhat in the 1930s as the emphasis shifted in National Socialist Germany to German prehistory, and then after the Second World War things further get complicated. But nonetheless, these are long-term trends. And it's only in the 1980s and 90s that critical debate around that concept really began, particularly triggered by the publication of Martin Millet's well-known book on the Romanisation of Britain. So what are the problems then with this particular concept? It's been powerful, it's been used widely in the literature on Roman Britain and other Western provinces for a long time. Well, just to rehearse again these issues which have been written about by, as I said, a number of people, David Mattingly, Joan Webster, Richard Hingley, and so on. Well, there are several issues. One is simply to do with, again, sort of, I suppose this depends a little bit on how one defines Romanisation, really, but certainly if one tries to define it as a sort of intentional policy within the Roman Empire, that's difficult to sustain in terms of the evidence for the Roman Empire itself. Of course, there are certain bits, famously, for example, in reference to Britain, including a bit in the Agricola about Agricola's sort of seduction of the Britons with baths and so on. That passage needs to be seen as much about Tacitus's own agenda in terms of the corruption of the ideal of the noble savage as anything else. But certainly in terms of intentional Romanising as a policy, it's a bit tricky to sustain. There is then, of course, what I've just been talking about, the problems that any of us have now, really, in sort of simplistically using concepts which have such imperial era baggage in terms of our own history. Concepts from the late 19th and early 20th centuries have a lot of baggage, and it's not very effective to use them anymore. Another criticism oft cited, and I think Dominic just mentioned this, we have come to understand Romanisation as a top-down, homogenising, simplifying approach to what is a very complex phenomenon, or a range of complex interactions. The transformation of the Roman world is hugely intricate in different settings across both the West and the East. So, reducing it to sort of what's, again, a seductive simplification is a bit difficult. And in that vein, and perhaps I'm getting now actually here to a couple of points which I think are the most important in highlighting difficulties with the word and the concept of Romanisation, is that being Roman is a highly flexible and fluid thing. And I'll come back to this theme later on. We all sort of have an idea in our heads when we use the word Roman, but that's obviously only one type of Roman. And there are lots of different aspects to Roman sort of legal structures, Roman civic statuses, and Roman cultural practices, and they change over time, of course. So things like what is the Roman religion in the 1st century AD is very different to the Roman religion of the 4th century AD. So it's a fluid, it's a moving target. And again, therefore, difficult to simplify within one label. And then finally, and this may not be true every time somebody uses the term Romanizing, but one of the problems with it is, again, that sort of built into the concept is an assumption, really, that Romanness is something that the Romans bring to some part of the world and impose it as if it existed already in a well-defined sense, and that could simply then be appropriated or emulated by people in Britain or Gaul or wherever, and then that made everything more sort of uniform across the empire. When really, I think the reverse is true, that any of the different kinds of Romanness really are all products of the empire. And of course, the fact that the territorial conquest of much of what we call the Roman Empire preceded the institution of emperor is a good example of this, that the Roman Empire is kind of catching up on itself most of the time. What is Roman comes to be defined by having an empire. Now, I'll come back to this theme later, but whilst we should be careful about comparing the Roman and British empires as was done in the 19th century or the 20th century, nonetheless it is interesting to think about the comparisons, and one can argue similarly that British identity within the British Isles and then British identity writ large equally comes only into being through having an empire rather than being something that exists beforehand. But this process of the creation in the process of imperialism of what we come to call Romanness is really important. So, for all those reasons, we have moved on in many ways from talking about Romanizing. And as has already been mentioned, there are a few sort of alternatives that have appeared within the kind of within the literature in the post-colonial era, and there's a few of a sort of non-exhaustive list here for well, quite a while, and still in some quarters, I guess the idea of Romanization is certainly still used. Perhaps weak or vulgar Romanization, as it's sometimes been called, trying to extract some of the baggage from that label and use it in a more flexible term, or as a more flexible term. I think it is difficult to do that because it's still the same word, and unless we change the word, we don't change our thinking entirely, or at least we run into the problem of people using the same word to mean different things, which is usually a bad idea in scholarship. Then creolization has been mentioned, particularly Jane Webster has championed this, drawing upon, again, sort of a comparative perspective, this time with New World colonialism in the post-medieval period, looking at the Caribbean and the southern US, to investigate what might be going on in the Roman world from a bottom-up kind of perspective rather than a top-down one, and an approach to sort of cultural synthesis, and particularly taking account of the different power levels of different individuals. Then more recently we've been talking a bit about globalization, again, another kind of explicit modern parallel, more or less useful perhaps than the parallels with 19th century colonialism. And people working with this idea, like Richard Hingley or Martin Pitts, have used it to emphasize mobility around the Roman Empire of people and things and ideas, but also the diverse ways in which local groups adapted those mobile concepts. And then sort of a mixed bag of approaches at the bottom here, which have been developing more local perspectives or situated perspectives positioned in particular areas like Roman Britain, looking at, in David Mattingly's term, discrepancy, the different experiences of different groups within different areas of the empire, emphasizing regionality. And of course this is importantly, a theme which is coming out not only because of kind of theoretical trends changing, but because, particularly in the Western provinces, increasingly detailed studies of the material record are showing how much regional diversity there was, even within southern Britain, let's say, in terms of material culture use patterns and so on. And the theme of identity is really important in this kind of debate. The complexity of identity, Romanisation is all about identity. So as a discourse, in a way, it's a continuum, but what we've realised is that identity is always complicated. All of us has multiple identities, and so the label of Romanisation is problematic in encompassing all of that variation. So I'm not going to pick any one or other of those to talk about now. I just sort of put them out there as where things are kind of at, in terms of the fact that there is not a single universal paradigm that has taken over from Romanisation, which is a good thing in some ways, but maybe leads also to a kind of fragmentation of the debate, which may not be so helpful. I just want to briefly illustrate a couple of these issues, though, by highlighting a couple of aspects of first military and then rural archaeology to sort of demonstrate, I guess, why these new approaches have emerged and why there is this problem and what we need to take account of as we move forward. And sort of using both these kinds of case studies draws on the paper I recently published in Britannia on moving beyond Romanisation. Excuse me, I'm just going to grab a drink. So the military is traditionally seen as a major instrument of Romanisation. Certainly in many of the sort of textbooks about Roman Britain produced up until, well, really quite recently, the military takes that role. And also, sort of interestingly, has generally been seen as internally Romanised, that this is an institution that both internally and externally operates to spread Roman culture. Now, of course, there are a number of aspects of the evidence which do point in that direction, at least that there is some kind of military community with some common values across the Roman Empire. There's been a fair bit of work on this in the last couple of decades. People like Ian Haynes, whose recent book on the Auxilia does abandon the term Romanisation, but talks about incorporation, the way that soldiers were incorporated into military culture with quite a lot of common features across the empire. But even given that that is the case, we need to bear in mind that military Romanness is different to other kinds of Romanness. It's not the same as civic Romanness. It's not the same as aristocratic Romanness. There are particular aspects of military culture that mark it out as a sort of as a variant form of Roman culture, if we can call it that. And a good illustration of this, I guess, is shown in these two maps here, which I realise are a little bit small, but hopefully you can see the distribution. These are David Mattingly's maps from, these are taken from his 2011 publication on Roman imperialism, but showing the different distributions of inscribed altars and Romano-Celtic temples in Britain, highlighting that basically in the military zone in the north versus the south, people are doing different things as part of their religious practice. Now we might say that both of these are Roman, but they're different kinds of Roman practice, and that leads on to the question of whether it's helpful to talk about them as Roman at all, except in comparison with sort of completely other cultures. That these are different ways of operating the religious beliefs of people in those different areas. And obviously the military zone then has its own dynamics there. And equally important is the fact that, as again was mentioned just now in terms of what's going on in Egypt, that even though the Roman military has this quite sort of powerful identity, that we still sort of think of, I guess, quite a lot when, if you ask somebody to picture a Roman, it's quite likely they're going to picture a Roman soldier in Lorica Segmentata. But nonetheless, this institution, which has such a sort of strong image, if you like, is very much open to local influences. And importantly, I think it's in provinces like Britain and other frontier provinces where the presence of the military, but interacting with other people in that area, is generating some interesting cultural dynamics that really are hard to explain if one uses the concept of Romanization. And we only see those over the longer term if we start looking at transformation into the dominate, into the later empire. And just as one tiny snapshot really into this, the excavations I've been doing recently in Wales at Caerleon with Peter Guest from Cardiff University and supported heavily by Cadw, are showing a sort of sequence in the late Roman period that we can see in a number of other sort of military sites in Britain. So this is the site in Priory Field in Caerleon. It's within the fortress. This photo is slightly hard to interpret intuitively because it's a sort of negative image. The trenches that you can see within the main excavation trench are the robbed out wall lines of one wing of a warehouse building, legionary store building. And this was a key part of the fortress in the 2nd century and the 3rd century, but it seems to have changed quite a bit in the later Roman period. So in red here are the main wall lines. It's basically, as I say, one wing of a courtyard building with an internal courtyard on the left and an external courtyard on the right. And in blue there are the outlines or the mark showing you some later walls attached onto the shell of the warehouse building at some point in the late or early post-Roman period. Now the dating of these is imprecise at the moment. We're still debating this as we go through the post-excavation phase. But it's quite likely, at least these are 4th century. So this fits in with other changes in the fortress at Caerleon in the early 4th century through to the mid-4th century. Things like changes to the bathhouse, the major legionary bathhouse in the fortress, all of which indicate adaptations to the military architecture within a local context. In other words, people adjusting the uses of these buildings for their own purposes. Traditionally, this would have been interpreted as so-called squatters taking over the military base, but at Caerleon at least it's difficult to sustain that because we know that the extramural settlement is still in use up until the mid-4th century. So it's quite likely that soldiers are adapting their environment to a more local set of priorities. And you can see this across, certainly in Roman Britain, forts on Hadrian's Wall, for example, as well. And I have argued in the past, and still argue, that this ties in with the way, really from certainly the early 3rd century, actually, the empire is changing quite dramatically. There is fragmentation going on. Provinces are becoming more sort of self-sufficient, and what's happening with the military is kind of a microcosm of this. And again, I think this is a bit difficult to explain if we see the military only as an instrument of so-called Romanization. To take a completely different kind of example, sort of the opposite end of the spectrum perhaps, I want to just briefly look at sort of the countryside in Roman Britain, and traditionally again sort of rural communities in Britain and other western provinces are seen as having at best really participated in a sort of trickle-down model of Romanization, that their social betters were able to build villas and so on. They were lucky to get a few brooches and pots, but that was good enough. That was a little fragment of the Roman Empire that you could call your own. But again here, our evidence is improving substantially, and recent work by Mike Fulford and Neil Holbrook has really been showing the richness of evidence that is coming out of rural settlement in recent, or in the last couple of decades from developer-funded archaeology. And of course this is very significant because the rural population of Roman Britain is by far the majority, as indeed it must have been across much of the empire. And when we have this more detailed evidence, of course, of sites which were almost literally invisible to early generations of scholars, we can start to unpick what's going on in a bit more detail. And really, again, this sort of makes it difficult to sustain a linear model of cultural change where people are simply trying to be more Roman the longer they are in the Roman Empire. It doesn't really work like that. And the site which I just had up here is one sort of typical rural site in southwestern Britain, Cotswold community on the border between Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. The main nucleus of Iron Age and Roman settlement is here, and there are a few other periods of earlier settlement around in the landscape through the Bronze Age and Iron Age, really. And interestingly, the Roman period occupants do interact with that historical landscape as well. And I've published recently, a couple of years ago, 2012, a paper going into the evidence from this site, excavated and published by Oxford Archaeology in some detail, because I think we need to sort of start thinking a bit differently about how change operates in the Roman world and what factors are influencing different episodes of change through more of the sort of the whole of the Roman period, because quite a lot of the debate around Romanisation has remained quite rooted in the sort of obvious transitional period of the late 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. But if we look in the longer term, we start to see a different kind of rhythm. And this slightly peculiar image here shows an attempt to visualise how change actually happens through the finds evidence and the structural evidence from this sort of typical rural site. And what you can see on here is the chronology, very crudely, through the Roman period, and then different sort of major categories of archaeological evidence, the structural evidence, the pottery, coinage, and small finds. And what I've showed through these little sort of patches of shading, really, is areas or periods of peak activity where there is significant changes in the suite of artifacts being used or in the structural layout of the site. And, well, the Claudian conquest is here, but that shows up not at all, really, in these kind of peaks and troughs of activity on the site. So that, you might say, was largely irrelevant to the people living on this site as an event. Of course, its consequences do eventually come around, but we need to think about those consequences in terms of the power structures of the empire impinging upon people's lives rather than necessarily their aspirations to become Roman. And it's instructive, for instance, that things like their brooch suite that remained in use for probably quite a long period was largely influenced by what's been called by J.D. Hill and Sophia Jundy, the fibular event horizon in the 1st century BC, so well before the conquest officially. Take something like coinage, though. Coins don't really figure on the site up until the late 3rd, 4th century. So depending on how we measure Romanness, we're going to get completely different sort of dates of when that impact of the empire happened. Pottery, similarly, has sort of peaks and troughs. The main period where the pottery repertoire there's certainly some significant change in the late Iron Age, but then it's not till the mid-Roman period that there's, again, a sort of major surge in supply that's recorded on the site. And the structural sequence has sort of episodic reorganizations of the site. Now, these might be linked to the changing economy, for instance, to do with the fact that this settlement is quite near to Cirencester, so that has an impact. But the reorganisation of a few sort of drip gullies and drainage ditches is hard to think about if we're using the concept of Romanisation. What we do need to think about is the more subtle intricacies of imperial power and how people living on a farming site like this can adjust to that. And how they seek to adjust to it often actually is by drawing or creating links to a more traditional past, for example, by burying their dead in the remains of a Bronze Age barrow, as they did in the 4th century. So, as I said, these are very brief examples, and I don't have time to go into the complexity of the situation, and that, in a way, is illustrative of the problem. Complexity is harder to talk about. Romanisation makes things simple. It is seductive for that reason. But it does not help us, I think, understand how we go from that empire to this empire, from the beginning of the Principate, from the time when arguably our most sort of dominant idea of Roman culture is defined in the time of Augustus, through to a completely different Roman Empire of the Tetrarchy. The difficulties of defining what we mean by Roman and of sustaining an idea of a sort of linear process are too big for that concept. Of course, the empire has powerful effects, but equally the empire is being constantly regenerated and reshaped by its interactions, and the edges, the frontiers, are playing a big part of that, and they arguably define what is Roman in the 4th century. So how does that fit with the old idea of Romanisation? How can we encompass, again, in that idea, all of the different ways in which we might try to single out something that we call Roman? This is a non-exhaustive list of different aspects of living in the Roman Empire, some of which any individual may be sort of enacting or inhabiting at any given moment in a Roman way for that time, but others not necessarily. Again, there's a lot of complexity. And a lot of the different identities that people had operate on different scales, so we have to think about the individual in relation to their village or their settlement, in relation to their ethnicity, and the empire certainly helped shape people's ethnicities and so on. But also bear in mind that the population that we are studying, or the population we have traditionally studied and upon which ideas of Romanisation have largely developed, is perhaps only a small percentage. The sort of urban and military elite is only a small percentage of the total population of the empire. In a province like Roman Britain, it's people living on sites like Cotswold Community who are by far the majority. And so their experience of this changing entity of the Roman Empire is going to be very distinctive. So, to sum up, the problems I've tried to throw out here really are again, sort of quite well rehearsed, but they bear repeating because I think we need to be quite clear that Romanisation is an obstacle to our thinking about the Roman world. Equally, we need to ask ourselves, do we need a replacement word ending in -ization, globalisation or whatever, to replace the concept when the problem is simplification and inevitably a sort of one-word answer is probably going to be a wrong answer. I think Richard Rees said something similar a couple of decades ago. Similarly, we're showing increasingly that regional diversity is huge across the Roman world, but even if we resist simplification that comes with the word Romanisation, we still kind of want to create a big picture, and we need to create a big picture because we need to be able to communicate about the Roman past to lots of different audiences, and big pictures help us do that. And in a way, the final point there relates to that we got ourselves into a lot of trouble in the late 19th century as a discipline by making easy comparisons with what were then the contemporary empires of the day and assuming that the British were basically like the Romans or vice versa. That doesn't mean that all comparisons should be off the table, though, because comparison is a useful academic tool. And certainly in more recent times, people have been, thinking and constantly rewriting histories of empire and of what goes on in the contemporary world. And so some of the globalization debate has been playing off things like Harton Negri's book on empire, Richard Hingley's work, for example. Also interesting in this respect is Yasmin Alabaya Brown's recent book on how the British Empire shaped English identity in the 19th and 20th centuries, and indeed earlier. And so there are comparisons perhaps to be made that kind of flip around the polarity of the top-down version of Romanisation. And we should explore those, but without trying to reduce the complexity. It's the complexity and richness of the Roman world that makes us interested in it, and therefore we should try to capture that more effectively. On that note, I will finish. Thank you very much.